I can't imagine anything more disheartening for a developer than to have their game ignored. That's what happened to System Shock 2, of which BioShock is the alleged spiritual successor. Shock 2 has since done a Blade Runner, and today people get it and it makes it onto many critics' all-time best whatever lists. But at the time its reception was pretty lukewarm, and sandwiched between Half-Life and Deus Ex, it was overlooked and ignored. BioShock, on the other hand, came at exactly the right time and made all the right moves to get noticed. Sporting an engine that's halfway between UE 2.5 and UE 3, supporting DirectX 10, coming to consoles, and having a very distinctive art style, it was the kind of game that made a lasting impression. It also had a metric fuck ton of hype around it thanks to the cult of Shock 2 expecting, or at least hoping, that BioShock would effectively be System Shock 3. Thanks to that, and to the Great Exo 6 trailer that tricked just enough people into believing that that was actual in-game footage, BioShock had more word of mouth than most games could dream of, and this was a whole year before the game's release. And so, despite being extremely similar games, System Shock 2 was perhaps in the wrong place, and certainly at the wrong time, and was overlooked, while BioShock had all the requisite glitz, glamour, and hype needed to get on everyone's wish list. System Shock 2 is an intelligent, intricate game that pretty much required that you play it through once to fully understand it before you could go back and experience it properly in the second playthrough. In part, this was bad design. In part, it was unavoidable. After all, the game is intelligent and intricate, with dozens of things the player needs to know in order to make informed decisions about the many game-changing elements with which the player interacts. But rather than work on these issues, the developers, Irrational Games, decided to jerk their knees as far as they could, creating a game that caters specifically to the lowest common denominator. Rather than take System Shock 2 and maintain its complexity while making it easier to understand, they took System Shock 2 and just stripped out all of the complexity. I understand their reasons, and I would have had a similar desire to make my game more understandable if I was put in their position, but they took it way too far. The end result is that BioShock, despite all its philosophical and religious allusions, is an immensely stupid and derivative game. BioShock is set in the underwater city of Rapture, created by Andrew Ryan, a man who wanted to be free of the constraints governments and religions imposed upon him. Although the city was founded in the 40s, the game is set in the 60s. You begin the game on an aeroplane that crashes while flying over Rapture. You survive, and you make your way down into the city. Rapture has really gone to shit in the 20 years since its founding. You find the city ruined and its people twisted mentally and physically. Through advanced scientific techniques and courtesy of a newly discovered sea slug, it had become possible for people to alter their genetic code, being able to do things like change their gender and gaining the ability to shoot fireballs from their fingertips. This brought with it the promise of a better future for the citizens of Rapture, but unsurprisingly led to its downfall. Almost immediately after arriving in the city, a man named Atlas gets in touch with you through a radio communicator and offers to help you through Rapture if you help his wife and child in return. As you explore the city, you're introduced to several of its major characters, either in the flesh or through the radio diary messages left around the city. There are also ghostly apparitions that appear now and then to relay uncannily convenient story elements. Through these numerous narrative devices, you'll piece together the many little stories of Rapture's history. Now, BioShock's story is magnificent, filled with interesting characters, concepts, and twists. But the problem with it is that I've already experienced it. Everyone who's played System Shock 2 has already experienced it. BioShock's story is taken almost in its entirety from System Shock 2, with only a few changes made. Almost everything in BioShock either exists in Shock 2 unchanged, or has some identical counterpart, either thematically or structurally. Like System Shock 2, BioShock's writing is fantastic, mostly being written by Ken Levine, whose ability to write is without equal in the gaming industry. And while I take exception to the fact that several of the working class and the undesirable elements of Rapture appear to be British, the voice acting is superb, and the way the story is told is truly second to none. Well, second to one. The remainder of this part of the review is going to be a detailed synopsis of BioShock's story and how it compares to System Shock 2's. Continue on to part 2 if you want to watch the rest of the review without any spoilers. System Shock 2 opens with your character emerging from a cryonic chamber on the Von Braun, a starship making its maiden voyage. You find the Von Braun to be a claustrophobic, self-contained environment, an environment wholly isolated from civilization and from the safety nets we rely on, like police officers and supermarkets. BioShock opens with your characters plane crashing over Rapture, your character surviving and making it down into the city. You find Rapture to be a claustrophobic, self-contained environment, an environment wholly isolated from civilization and from the safety nets we rely on, like police officers and supermarkets. In System Shock 2, a character named Dr. Janice Polito contacts you and asks for assistance, and in exchange she will guide you through the ship, which has been lost to a hostile alien force known as the Many. In BioShock, a character named Atlas contacts you and asks for assistance, and in exchange he will guide you through the city of Rapture, which has been lost to a hostile force, the Insane Splicers. In System Shock 2, you find the former crew mostly dead, with those few who survived now transformed into agents of the Many, hell-bent on your death. You further find that the ship has suffered from a host of problems. In the words of one character,
Delacroix was right. The ship was not ready for prime time. Okay, the automatics...
and that the ship's security system, consisting of cameras and sentry guns, has been co-opted by a hostile alien force. In BioShock, you find the former residents mostly dead, with those few who survived now transformed into insane drug addicts hell-bent on your death. You further find that the city suffered from a host of problems, in the words of one character.
If things weren't bad enough, it seems that even our water system sprung a leak. Yep, that's right. Irrigation system in Arcadia is taking on seawater. That's only...
and that the city's security system, consisting of cameras and sentry guns, has been co-opted by a hostile alien force. In System Shock 2, Polito eventually reveals herself to actually be Shodan, the insane AI with a god complex, and that you are her pawn in a civil war between her and the alien force, the Many. It is revealed that Shodan created the Many and then lost control of it. In BioShock, Atlas reveals himself to really be Fontaine, the gangster and smuggler extraordinaire of Rapture, and that you are his pawn in a civil war between him and Andrew Ryan. Ryan created Rapture, and then lost control of it. In System Shock 2, Shodan notes late into the game that with every cybernetic enhancement you get, you are being remade in her image, that you are her cybernetic monster. In BioShock, Fontaine reveals late into the game that he created you using Andrew Ryan's genetic material, and programs you to do his bidding, that you are his genetic monster. In System Shock 2, you kill the Many and go on to eventually destroy Shodan in a pretty terrible boss battle. In BioShock, you assassinate Andrew Ryan and eventually go on to destroy Fontaine in a pretty terrible boss battle. Anyone who's played System Shock 2 has already experienced BioShock's main story virtually in full, and although each game has its own smaller stories, these are for the most part thematically very similar. For instance, in System Shock 2, the Von Braun security force becomes very hard-nosed, to the extent that they execute people who get in their way. Something which also happens in BioShock, as Ryan begins to see that he is losing control of Rapture. In System Shock 2, numerous malfunctions and problems plague the ship, while Rapture likewise suffers similar problems. In both cases because people were impatient and cut corners. And the major plot twist in both games is the reveal that your guide through the game is in fact an enemy and has been using you. In System Shock 2, you can probably guess it if you're familiar with the original System Shock. The Many asks you things like, why do you do the bidding of the Metal Mother? And of course Shodan's face is on the front of the box. But even if you do guess it, it's still a guess. BioShock is so similar to System Shock 2 that anyone who's played Shock 2 will see it coming. You may want to dismiss this as trivial or argue that there is much more to the story. But first of all, the story is such a central element of both games. Without it, the overall experience is significantly lessened, if not ruined. Secondly, there is much more to the story, and most of it was also in System Shock 2 as well. And thirdly, to defend them for using an identical story is a great disservice to the entire medium of computer games. Games with such magnificent stories are so rare and so special, they should be protected. Imagine if your favourite film was remade as a really stupid Hollywood action film, or if the story of your favourite book made its way onto the pages of the next popular trashy vampire romance novel. Would you accept that? Would you defend that? You wouldn't. And it's a disservice to all computer games that BioShock's story is celebrated. Now, sure, Irrational did co-develop System Shock 2. It is their story. As many people I've discussed this topic with have stated, they do have the right to reuse it. But that doesn't make reusing it acceptable, and it certainly doesn't make it commendable.